Well, I'm Dr Stan Beckensall, and normally I'm known for my prehistory and general books about Northumberland. But because I live in Hexham, I've spent a lot of time on Hadrians Wall. I've walked quite a lot of the central part, which is the most interesting, and to me anyway. And I've spent time at Vindolanda and the other important sites along here. So I'm in a position to be able to talk about the general purpose of Hadrian's Wall and about its downfall and about the things that you can see on the way. Well, we're standing in Hexham Abbey, and this is the south transept. And when it was being built, they used stones which had come from Roman Corbridge to build it, and the actual crypt of the abbey too is made out of Roman stones. It's quite easy to see. It makes people think that there used to be a Roman settlement here, but that's not true. It's all recycled material coming from the wall and its forts. And this is one of the most famous of all the stones. This is Flavinus. Now, he was a young officer in the Roman army. He's wearing a torque around his neck, which emphasizes his rank, and he's carrying a standard which has the sun god on it. And he's fully accoutred as a cavalryman, a cavalry officer. And what's so interesting, you can see all the trappings of the horse on there, and it's rampant, and underneath it there's this poor little barbarian. They have a name for these people, which is Britunculi, and that's the old Brits. And people used to think that he was waiting to stab the horse, and they used to perpetrate this myth. But in fact, he's being downtrodden. This is like many other examples of Roman arrogance and celebrating their dominance of the local people. As you can see, he's bearded, he's got a short sword, he's got a round shield, and the man's foot is kicking him, and the horse is about to trample all over him. And the inscription underneath tells who he is, Flavinus. Now, we're so used to thinking of Romans with straight roads, central heating, bathhouses, but in fact the reality of the Roman conquest of Britain is that it was bloody and it was ferocious, and a lot of people were killed. And we must remember this. And so this memorial is a reminder of the arrogance, really, of the Roman army. It speaks of arrogance. It's downtrodden barbarians by the great, superior, well-dressed Roman officers. Now, this is reality, and we're coming into the 1900th anniversary of the building of Hadrian's Wall, which lies to the north of here. And it's usual for people to think of Romans as baths, central heating, straight roads and things like that. But the reality is they could have only done that if they'd been an efficient group of killers, which is what they were. They were the greatest army of the time, and this killing was their business. So his little sword is useless, but this man's sword here, as we see down here, is going to be much more lethal, and they were better organized. So when we're celebrating the 1900th anniversary of the Roman conquest, we've got to remember that it's all sorts of things. It's people who are not Roman, people who've taken on a military role because they've got no alternative, joining the army to see the world, and there they find themselves here. They might have come from anywhere in Europe. They weren't necessarily at all Italians, but he would have been, because they were the ruling class, obviously. So there we are. But the ordinary Roman soldier was quite a different thing. Now, one thing about this is that people have concluded that he was actually painted, that it wasn't pure stone like this. This is good as stone because the light comes through the windows and it catches it and casts shadows. So it's quite a clear image. But in this display that we've got in the Abbey, you've got Flavinus on his horse, his plumed helmet, as you can see, and there's his standard of the sun god on it. And he's properly dressed in this, and that's the realism of what this was. Now, this event is a celebration of the foundation of Hadrian's Wall. It's being celebrated all through Northumberland at the moment. It's a most magnificent frontier, but in fact in some ways it was a sign of failure, because what Hadrian was saying when he came here is, we have now finished the conquest, we can't go any further. And they built the wall as a barrier. It wasn't a military barrier in that you had soldiers all the way along all the time. It was almost a sign of achievement. You know, this is what we can do, and there was nothing like it in the barbarian world. A wall about 15, 20 feet high in places, made out of very well cut stone. And so this celebration of Hadrian's Wall is quite an important one for the area. People come from miles to see it. It's a very important place to attract walkers, and it's got well signposted all the way along. And this is an incredible thing that we've got here, because it's one of the very few complete memorials of one of the officers who is in charge of the army. Now, it's not unique, because all through the Roman world you get the same sort of thing. Dominance, arrogance, crushing the barbarian. And this is just one of many, but this happens to be a particularly good example. So what I'm doing today is to point out some great points about the Roman wall, the most important things to see when you walk along it, which gives you a very good idea of the kind of skill in building it and the logic behind it, because the plans did change as it went along. For example, the last thing to be put on the wall were the forts. So instead of having them behind, like Corbridge and Vindolanda, they brought them up to the wall so that they could deal more effectively with any barbarians that dared to attack it. But in fact, it's a sign of failure in a way, the wall. We can't go any further, we're going to stop here. There's another wall in Scotland called the Antonine Wall, and that was abandoned. That's further north, of course. And so this became the major end of empire. And that's what I've always called this, that it is the end of empire. Well, this is my book on the Roman wall. I have been doing articles on this as well, particularly one recently for the Northumbrian. But this one in it has got a poem. This poem I wrote to celebrate really the ordinary Roman soldier who was instrumental in building the wall, because it wasn't done by slave labour, it would have been done by the army. and everybody had to have a skill in building. It's called Hadrians Wall, a place where empire halts. Mist-haunted desolation holds in check the will to move ahead, and soldiers' eyes uneasily survey vast northern wastes. And enter Conquest, like a fire that fades, but embers grow and can be fanned into a flame. A regiment of stone, a geometric pattern from rock and soil, or forced persistently with toil, something to wonder at, admire, triumph of discipline, ordering a landscape to obey. Shut out the cold, stoke up the hypercaust, bring in our standards and our gods. Each turret, force, and castle on the wall becomes a reassurance of a different world. The sound of marching, whiplash of command, the clash of interlocking shields on alien soil, reaffirmation of the glory that was Rome. Our hands rough cut with mortar and sharp stone, legs stiff with pushing loaded carts through mud, a finger broken on high scaffolding, thumb crushed by mauls in rock-cut ditch. These were the lowest prices that we paid. We joined the legions and we fought, became the masters of the north, and our reward, as we are dwarfed, crushed by the shelter of our wall, housed in our barrack blocks, patrolling roads or dicing all our pay away, is to be part of ranks on ranks of stone, cut to order, bound by harsh winds flayed. When I am dead, no one can really take my place. This wall will crumble, have to be rebuilt, fall down again, be quarried for its stone. Yet I am part of it. I lie in the foundation of a road, or feel the warm breath of a calf in byre, or watch a visitor admire the remnants of my work. And that is my poem about the ordinary soldier, celebrating whatever happens. And we've got to remember that these people are human beings as well as killers, and armies are like that. But they have families, and on the wall, particularly this part of the world, in Europe, we have some of the most important things to say about the soldiers, because at places like Vindolanda, we've got writing tablets which give an incredible personal view of what life was like. People ordering food or underpants from home, anything like that. It's just, and families living there, little boys playing with swords and women doing their cooking and so forth. So it's a whole life as well. There were thousands of people living along the wall, and they were housed in these incredible forts, many of them, or just outside. And these are known as the Vici, or the Vicus, which is a kind of extension of the fort. It was protected by the fort. It was a place where people lived. And so we've got all that in Northumberland, a tremendous cross-section of what life was like for the legionary soldiers and the auxiliaries too, and how these people would come from everywhere, from Libya, from Germany, from everywhere in the world that was controlled by the Romans. It's an amazing construction altogether. And there we are. It's the photographs are going to be something which will give some glimpses, my own personal glimpses of what I think are really important. So we've got the construction itself, which goes over natural basalt. What happened is that in the past, geological past, this was sedimentary rocks like limestone, coal, sandstone, and then there was a huge upheaval of volcanic basalt that came through these sedimentary rocks, and it formed a kind of up and downness, which is what is so delightful for walkers, because they go up and down and you get little gaps in it called nicks, like Sycamore Gap, and all these things are very, very well known now, important features in the landscape. And you've got the two things then, the natural, the basalt itself, or dolerite, or whinstone as it's sometimes called, dominating the landscape. And then you've got the man-made structure which follows that geological formation. And that's what I find so fascinating, that when Hadrian came to decide where the wall should go, he had the geology in mind and used it brilliantly. Now, if you want to see how the wall was built, there are plenty of sections where you can actually see the construction of it. And the evidence of changes can be seen in this photograph, where you see different widths of wall, one on top of the other. That's either because they found it a bit expensive and time-consuming to build a wide wall and decided to build it narrower, or because part of it had been broken down in a war. Now, the plan of the wall was to provide a frontier to control movements in either direction. Previously, there had been a frontier, but this was a new one. And it was built because there was such a huge military presence there. The large numbers of soldiers were available to do the work, thousands of them. And there was always a threat from the tribes in the north. So this wall had to be very solid, very well constructed, as we can see in this picture. The next picture shows that the wall is not solid dressed stone. People imagine a wall to be the same thickness all the way through, but the Romans built it by making a triangular series of stones, and the base of the triangle formed the smooth part of the outside of the wall, and inside they sort of keyed into each other, and then they made the two skins of the wall and then filled it full of rubble and perhaps clay, and sometimes used cement. Now, the east gate at Bird Oswald, which is the next picture, shows that the army was very skilled at building in stone, unlike the local people. And this picture shows that there's actually an arch beginning to go over. It isn't complete, obviously, here it's fallen down. What happens is that a lot of the stone was robbed. A lot of farms are built of it, but the major source of destruction was for the military road that was built between Newcastle and Carlisle during the Jacobite rebellions, and they found they just couldn't move things because the carts are getting bogged down, and that's when they decided that they would use the Roman wall as building material. So there we are. Now there's not just the wall, but in front of it there was a ditch, and this went all the way through, follow the wall, in front of the wall, and between the ditch and the wall itself, very often there'd be stakes in the ground. But one of the interesting parts of the wall is at a limestone corner where the ditch is unfinished. It goes through basalt. It's got nothing to do with limestone. It's badly named, actually. And in that one, you get all the signs of construction or quarrying, and then they give up. So somebody from the union came out and said, right, lads, that's enough, everybody out. And they've abandoned it. They've abandoned the stones that have come out of it. And it's a very interesting part to see, as you can see here in this picture. Now, that was in front of the wall. Now, there was another thing behind the wall, was something called the Valon. And the Valon is a great massive ditch which runs all the way along it. And the idea of this really was that it should have crossing places where people could come over, and they would only be allowed to go through the wall at certain points. And of course they were taxed there. So there was a logic behind this, taxation. And it's beautifully done. In places it's still very, very clear. In fact, it's clearer than the wall itself in some places, as we see here. Now, they built mile castles to house about, 15 to 20 soldiers at each Roman mile. But in between the mile castles, there were turrets. And this is another thing you see. And in this photograph, you see the base of the turret built against the wall, and it isn't keyed in. It sort of abuts it. You know, normally if you build something, as they did in some places, they build the turret first and then brought the wall up to it so that it's properly keyed in. But this picture shows that in some places it was added. At each Roman mile, as I said, was a mile castle, and it had at first 2 entrances, but some of them are stupidly built so that they face the scarp of the dolerite, and so they block that gate off. And this one you can see in this picture at Caulfields would have taken a small garrison. And you can see it's built on the sides, on the slope, which is an odd thing to do. But then if you're told to build a mile castle every mile, it didn't matter. You built it there, you did what you were told. And the next picture shows where there is a quarry with a lake in it at Caulfields, where this went into big production, exporting lots of whinstone for road building and that sort of thing. And it was only closed quite recently. And you can still see the whole cross-section of the dolerite and the lake in front of it. But what you don't see in the picture is right on the top of the peak is the end of the Roman wall. They've cut right through the wall, and it was quite dramatic, as you see here. Now, sometimes they would add another fortification because they realised that they'd missed something. And at Peel Gap, which you can see in this picture, it's being excavated, and it shows that it's a kind of mile castle that's been plugged in to cover that particular weakness in the defence of the wall. People, of course, lived along the wall, and they had to be fed. Now, a lot of grain was imported through ports like South Shields and so forth, but some of the area actually has visible fields which are in terraces, and outside Howstead's fort you can see some of these terraces quite clearly, as you can in this picture. It's where they grew grain. Now the next picture is Howstead's fort, which, following up from the last thing, is the granary. And this granary, you can tell, was meant to be a sturdy thing because it's got very big buttresses against the walls. And inside it's got a lot of little pillars that the floor was put on because they realised that you needed a circulation of air to keep the wheat fresh and also to keep some rats and things out. So there we have it, a very, very good example of one of the granaries in a Roman fort. Now, when they cooked, they didn't have a mess as you do today, a communal eating place. They had individual ovens, and these were often built within the wall itself. And these that you can see here at Bird Oswald form a part of the wall itself of the fort. And that's quite interesting, that it's an individual thing. Cooking. Now, it would be wrong to miss out the most famous of all the Roman wall constructions, which is the Loo at Howstead's. And as you can see from this picture, it really is quite remarkable, particularly when you consider what the barbarians would have been using as a loo. Here you get the water coming from the tops of the buildings into big tanks, and the tanks have got sort of plug holes in them so that you can let the water out to rinse the loo. And in the middle of it you've got a kind of big bowl, and they dipped in sticks with, you know, to wash themselves afterwards. So there we have it. This one's at Howstead's, and it's absolutely amazing construction. It would have had 2 rows of seats. There's no privacy, no individual closets. It was just people watching each other from each side. So there we have it. Now, if you go to Blackpool or another place, you might come back with a souvenir visit to Blackpool. Well, the Romans had the equivalent of that for people visiting the walls, and this was called the Rudge Cup. And it's a very important piece of pottery because it's got the names of all the forts around the top edge of it. But that's not the only thing, of course, as we'll see in the next picture. Pottery is one thing, but detailed accounts of what people actually did in their lives come from Vindolanda. Now, Vindolanda is a most extraordinary place because it's a series of forts built one on top of each other. Now, when the Romans evacuated a fort, they filled it in. They didn't just leave it. And so anything that was in it was buried, and it got wet. And there you get a kind of anaerobic situation where nothing decays. And so there we are. And it preserves leather, it preserves wood, it preserves everything. And as Robin Burley said when he was excavating it, you could actually take the top off it and you could smell the decay of the plants. Well, one of his great discoveries was the Vindolanda writing tablets. Now, people used to write on these wooden tablets, which were covered with wax, with a stylus. And what they discovered was that if you found one of these writing tablets, ultraviolet light would reveal what was written on it in ink. And so you've got a whole history in writing, which is unique, not just in Britain, but in Europe. So, you know, Northumberland is really good at that. And when I asked some archaeologists what were their most famous finds, Robin said immediately, the birthday invitation. And this was one woman in a fort inviting people, a friend of hers, to come to a birthday party. Now that is unique. I also asked Lindsay Ellison Jones what her favourite one was, and that was interesting. The next picture will show this. It's a picture of a woman seated, a very grandiose thing, and it turns out that she's a slave girl originally, and a Roman fell in love with her and actually married her, and when she died he built a memorial to her. Now that's most unusual too. So again you get a woman who's important. We might have Flavinus at the other end as a man, but here we've got a woman who's actually freed from slavery. Quite a different thing altogether. Finally was a discovery when I was there. I saw this being discovered, and it's an altar stone. And oddly enough, this commemorative altar stone is built within the fort itself. Normally they're built outside, so the location is odd. And as you can see, it's got a kind of bull with horns, and there's a figure on top of it holding a hammer in one hand and a bunch of arrows in the other. Now this is Jupiter, but it's a Jupiter who comes from Turkey. And it also shows that the Romans were not averse to adopting other people's gods and goddesses, and they brought them and incorporated them in their own structure. So in that sense it was truly international. And on that note, I think it's a good place to end, because we started with a Flavinus memorial, and we end with this coming all the way from Turkey. And it's an interesting one.